A good morning to you all. So yesterday, during our lecture, we managed to discuss the evidence handling procedures that an investigator has to follow. We also went a step further. We defined what digital evidence is, why digital evidence is important, the challenges for digital evidence. We also went a step further and we discussed the characteristics of digital evidence. So today, we're going to move a step further and discuss with respect to types of digital data that exist. So, we have various types of digital data that exist. We have what we call volatile data. So, volatile data can be modified and it contains system time, users that are currently logged on, files that are open, network information, currently running processes, process memory, clipboard contents, service or driver information, as well as command history. Volatile data, some would actually want to term it as data that is actually perishable, in the sense that when the power is actually switched off from a computer, then that data will be lost. So we have volatile data as a type of digital data. We also have what we call transient data. So transient data contains information such as open network connection, user logout, programs that actually reside in memory, and cache data. So just like volatile data, if the machine is turned off, all the information is lost permanently. So as an investigator, you need to know the type of digital data that you want to collect as evidence. Why? Because failure to do so will actually lead to loss of vital evidence that might actually help us or assist us to solve a particular incident. We also have what we call non-volatile data. So non-volatile data is used for the secondary storage and is long-term persisting. We're basically saying non-volatile data contains hidden files, slack space, swap files, index.dat files, unallocated clusters, unused partitions, hidden partitions, registry settings, and event logs. So, the moment that you have data that's actually stored on secondary storage, and that data can be stored for a long term, then that type of data is called non-volatile data. So non-volatile data is simply the opposite of volatile data. We also have what we call fragile data. So fragile data is that information that is temporarily saved on the hard disk and can be changed. Fragile data contains information such as last access time, last access timestamps, access date on files, then the date when a particular file was last modified. That's an example of fragile data. On types of digital data, we also have what we call temporarily accessible data. So temporarily accessible data are stored on the hard disk and are accessible only for a certain time. And temporarily accessible data contains data like encrypted file system information. We also have what we call active data. So active data is the data presently used by the parties for their daily operations. This data is direct and straightforward to recognize and access using the current system. We also have what we call archival data. So archival data manages data for long-term storage and maintains records. So if data is actually managed for a long time or for a long term in storage, and there is a record of that data, then we refer to that as archival data. We also have backup data as a type of digital data. So backup data refers to a copy of the system data. This data can be used at any time of recovery process after a disaster or a system crashes. So in most organizations, you will discover that depending on the policy that exists within that particular organization, data can be backed up at the end of the day, or usually at the end of the day. But now, the type of backup can either be an incremental backup or a complete backup. So, depending with the policy of an organization, most organizations create backups. So, those backups are the ones that we actually refer to as backup data. We have what we call residual data. So, the data that is stored on a computer when a document is deleted is called residual data. We're basically saying when a file is deleted, the computer tags the file space instead of cleaning the file memory. So the file can be retrieved until the space is reused. Alright, what we're basically saying is when data is deleted on a computer, the space on which the data was stored, data data can actually be retrieved in the event that that space is not reused or there is no data that is actually overwrite or written on that space in the file memory of where that particular file was. So that is residual data. We also have what we call metadata. So metadata maintains a record about a particular document. The record includes the file format, and how, when, and who created, saved, and modified the file. So, in other terminology, metadata, we simply refer to it as data about the data. That is metadata. In digital evidence, we have what we call rules of evidence. So, evidence that is to be presented in the court must actually comply with the established rules of evidence. And we are saying, prior to the investigation process, it is important that the investigator actually understands the rules of evidence. So, when we want to try and define what is rules of evidence, so basically, rules of evidence governs whether, when, how, and for what purpose proof of a case may be placed before a trier of fact for consideration. And the trier of fact may be a judge or a jury, depending on the purpose of the trial and the choices of the parties. So basically, we are saying evidence that has to be presented in the court of law must actually comply with established rules of evidence. And rules of evidence, we're simply saying they govern whether, when, how, and for what purpose some certain pieces of proof of a case may be placed before a judge or a jury for fact for consideration. Best evidence rule. So, the best evidence rule is actually established to prevent any alternation of digital evidence, either intentionally or unintentionally. So, the best evidence rule states that the court only allows the original evidence of a document, a photograph, or recording at the trial rather than a copy. But the duplicate will be allowed as an evidence under the following conditions. So a duplicate will be allowed as an evidence if original evidence is destroyed due to fire or flood, when an original evidence is destroyed in the normal course of business, or when the original evidence in possession of a third party. Those are only the conditions when a copy or a duplicate will be allowed as an evidence in the court of law. So basically, that's the best evidence rule. So, with what we call digital evidence examination process, we have what we call digital evidence examination process. So basically, the process is divided into 5 stages or 5 processes. So the first process is what we call evidence assessment. When we've managed to successfully complete evidence assessment, we move on to evidence acquisition. The process of evidence acquisition when it is done, we move on to evidence preservation. From evidence preservation, we go on to evidence examination and analysis. Then last but not least, we need to actually document the evidence as well as to report it. So, in order for us as forensic investigators to understand the digital evidence examination process, we are going to try and explain briefly what happens or what each process actually entails. So we're going to start by evidence assessment. So during evidence assessment, we are saying the digital evidence should be thoroughly assessed with respect to the scope of the case to actually determine the course of action to take. So, in order for us to conduct a thorough assessment by reviewing the search warrant or other legal authorization, case detail, nature of hardware and software, potential evidence sought, and the circumstances surrounding the acquisition of the evidence. So during evidence assessment, there are certain activities or processes that we need to prioritize the evidence where necessary. And during the process of prioritizing the evidence, we have to look at two things, which is the location where the evidence is found or the stability of the media to be examined. We also need to determine how to document the evidence. For example, when we're talking about photographs or sketches or notes. During evidence assessment, we also need to evaluate storage location for electromagnetic interference. Like for instance, let's say we have managed to seize a mobile device. When we seize a mobile device that is actually transmitting some form of signals to a remote location, we need to actually evaluate where we're going to store that digital evidence. Because at the end of the day, if that digital evidence or that mobile device is actually communicating or is in sync or it has a link with an attacker remotely, then the attacker might actually decide to delete critical data, or the attacker might try to cover up for the incident that would have actually have taken place. So during evidence assessment, we also need to determine the condition of the evidence as a result of packaging, transport, or storage. So knowing the condition of the evidence is very, very important to an investigator when we are trying to perform evidence assessment. We also need to assess the need to provide continuous electric power to the battery operated devices. When we feel that we've managed to perform evidence assessment to our satisfactory, we move on to the next process, which is evidence acquisition. So digital evidence is fragile and can be altered, damaged, or destroyed by improper handling or examination. So, in case of failure, evidence may be unusable or it may lead to an inaccurate conclusion. So we need to acquire the original digital evidence in a manner that actually protects and preserves the evidence. When we've managed to perform evidence acquisition, we move on to the next process, which is preserving of the digital evidence. So, in order for an investigator to actually preserve digital evidence, there is a checklist that he or she needs to follow. All right. An investigator needs to ensure that your actions are repeatable. An investigator needs to ensure that your actions are repeatable. And we're basically saying, as a way of preserving digital evidence, do not run any antivirus program because it can actually change the date and time of each file that is scanned. An investigator also needs to capture an accurate image of the system as possible as a way of trying to preserve digital evidence. But however, we are saying if any changes occurs during the collection of the evidence, you ought or you need to actually document all the changes accordingly. If the victim system is connected to the internet, use the same path that is used by the intruder to extract the data from the victim's computer. As a way of also preserving digital evidence, we need to disconnect the victim's computer from the internet to protect it from further attack. Do not use the original data regularly for examination. Like let's say for instance, we seize our original media from a particular incident. We're basically saying during the process of data analysis, one might easily compromise the integrity of the data. And in the event that we need to present that evidence in the court of law, we'll need the best evidence, or the best evidence rule ought to apply in that particular case. So, as a way of trying to analyze our digital evidence, we always say do not use the original data regularly for examination, but instead you have to make use of working copies. As a way of preserving digital evidence, we say do not run any program on the victim's computer. So, you will discover that once this process or once this stage is complete, we need to move to the next stage or the next process, which is evidence examination. So during evidence examination, we basically have two processes that we carry out. We have preparation and extraction. So during preparation, we actually prepare working directory or directories on separate media to which evidentiary files and data can be recovered and or extracted. Then on extraction, there are two different types of extraction. We have the physical extraction and the logical extraction. So the physical extraction phase actually identifies and recovers data across the entire physical drive without the file system. That is the physical extraction. Then on the logical extraction, we're basically saying the logical extraction phase actually identifies and recovers files and data based on the installed operating system, file system, and or applications. So we are basically identifying and recovering files and data that are currently installed on an operating system. That is the logical extraction. So once we perform that process, we also need to analyze the extracted data. So analysis is the process of simply interpreting the extracted data to determine their significance to the case. So some examples of analysis that may be performed include with what we call the time frame analysis, we have data hiding analysis, we have application and file analysis, we have ownership and possession. So analysis may require a review of the request for service, legal authority for the search of the digital evidence, investigative leads, or analytical leads. Documenting the evidence. Documentation of the digital evidence examination is actually an ongoing process. Therefore, it is important to correctly record each step during the examination process. So, reports should be written simultaneously with the examination, and presentation of the report should be consistent with the departmental policies. With what we call the evidence examiner report. So the common consideration list that actually helps the examiner through the documentation process is as follows. We're basically saying an investigator should take notes when discussing with the case investigator. The examiner should take notes when discussing with the case investigator. We also say the examiner needs to preserve a copy of the search authority and chain of custody documentation. Writing detailed notes about each action taken is a characteristic or is mandatory for an evidence examiner. The evidence examiner report should also include date, time, complete description, and result of each action taken in the documentation. The examiner's report should also document any irregularities encountered during the examination process, and the report should also include the operating system's name, software, and installed patches. So, on the presentation is an assignment. So this assignment, I've also uploaded the assignment on your Google Classroom. So when you're done with this assignment, you need to actually submit it on Google Classroom. If you're experiencing any problems, like for instance, you want to submit the assignment, you're done with the assignment. If you're experiencing any problems, like uploading the assignment on Google Classroom, please feel free to contact me. But however, if I'm unavailable, you can just send the assignment to me via email, but let the sending of the assignment via email be a second option. So about the assignment is a very, very simple assignment, and it constitutes of, or it has 4 questions, like question 1 up to question 4. So please, I would like to urge you guys not to, please do not copy. Yes, you might read around, you might Google, you might research, but when you find what you might think are solutions to some of the questions that are here, please, some of the things, instead of just copying and pasting, try and rephrase or write that in your own meaning. But sometimes you will discover that some of these questions, it's very, very easy to actually pinpoint who copied who from this assignment. So this assignment is going to be due on the 14th of August 2021. So I hope you're going to do this assignment and submit it on Google Classroom. In the event that Google Classroom is not, or you're finding difficulties uploading it on Google Classroom, as I have said, feel free to contact me. In the event that you do not find me, maybe due to other pressing situations, you can as well send the assignment to my email. So after everything has been said and done, are there any questions? Questions? If you have any questions, feel free to ask on the WhatsApp platform that we have. And if I see them, I will try as much as possible to respond to those questions. But however, if there are no questions, thank you very much for listening. Till we meet again for the next lecture. So for the next lecture, we're going to be discussing with respect to data acquisition. But now on data acquisition, when we explain what data acquisition entails, we're going to try and do a practical demonstration of how one can actually perform live data acquisition on a Windows system.